Shavua Tov, Boker Tov, gentlemen. Today's daf is daf Chaf in Yebamot, so we start from the Mishnah. Klal Omer be Yebamot. We learn again for a four shlema for Shlomo ben Rachel, Yosef Basriel ben Chaim Michal, Elazar ben Ruma, Yontav Blitman ben Dor, Pegachaya. Says the Mishnah, Klal Omer be Yebamot, we said a general principle. Kol shu iser erva lo choletzes flo misyabemes. If there's an iser erva, meaning you can't marry this Yevama. She fell like all the cases we've been talking about till now. Reuven died with no children, but he had been married to Shimon, his brother's daughter. Well, in that case, Shimon doesn't perform Yibam, of course not on his daughter, but even on the Tzara. That's the point. Rashi says, Saros of a Kolshkein he. So if there's an Isser Erva involved here, a forbidden relationship, then there's no Chalitza, there's no Yibam at all. That we basically learned from the first Mishnah. But here he gives you the general rule. Isser, woman goes free. Pardon? The woman goes free with no chalitza, no yibam is not necessary. She's totally free. Exactly. Both the daughter and the tzar. Isser mitzvah of Isser kedusha. Now here we're talking about different kinds of Isser where it's not an erva, not like kares, not like your sister-in-law fell to you or your daughter or your mother-in-law. Not a case like that. Here we're talking about Isser mitzvah. We're going to find in the Gemara as mitzvah as a drabanan. For example, Midaraisa, you can't marry your mother, obviously. What about your grandmother? The Torah doesn't prohibit you marrying your grandmother. Disgusting as it sounds to us, it's not prohibited, but the rabbis prohibit it. Let's say, I think another case like a great-granddaughter. You can't marry a woman and her daughter. You can't marry, even if it's not your daughter, your wife's daughter or your wife's granddaughter, the pasuk says. What about her great-granddaughter? You live a long time, and you have your great-granddaughter. Torah doesn't prohibit it, but the rabbis do. Okay, that's called Isser Mitzvah. However, the problem is if it's only Drabanan, Midaraisa, the Torah says you do make Yibam. Let's say your grandmother fell to you Yibam. Is that possible? Your grandmother on your mother's side, not related to your brother, married your brother. Your brother died with no children, right? So she fell Yibam to you. Okay, you're not going to perform Yibam on your grandmother. The Torah says you don't, the rabbi said you don't do it. But there's a mitzvah. Right? That's the essay of Yibam. So what do you do? So the rabbi said in a case like that, or Isser Kedusha, we'll talk about Isser Kedusha, that's going to be the one we talk about at length, which is, let's say, a Kohen marrying a Grusha. Kohen can't marry a Grusha, right? Right? So a Kohen could, right? So Isser Kedusha, but that's Minat Torah, but it's only a lav. If he marries her, the Kedushan's chal. Kid's not a mamzer and we're not going according to Rabbi Kiva. According in general, if an Isser Lav is involved, a man takes back his divorced wife after she's been married to somebody else, or a Kohen marries a Grusha, not supposed to, but the kid's not a mamzer, he's a Chalal, but he's not a mamzer. So what about in those cases? Choletz lo misyabemes. There's a mitzvah to do Yibum, right? So technically you could make Yibum, Esei, Docha, Lo Saseh. But we say in these cases, you do chalitza, not yibam. Now we're going to talk about that. Why don't we do yibam? If you have esed dachalosa say, why doesn't he do it? There's an essay to do yibam. Losa say, don't marry this woman, like a Kohen marrying a grusha, let's say. Why don't we do that now? Or a Kohen gadol marrying an almana, right? A Kohen gadol can't marry an almana. A Kohen can't marry a grusha. Why don't we say esed dachalosa? But we said what you do is do chalitza, don't do yibam, right? Why do you even have to do chalitza? If your daughter fell to you, or your sister-in-law, or your mother-in-law fell to you in Yibam, so like you say, you go out free, nothing, because it's an erva, kares, you don't do that, so there's no mitzvah of Yibam. But in these cases, there is a mitzvah of Yibam. There's a mitzvah of Yibam your grandmother. Torah doesn't say you can't marry your grandmother, so there's a mitzvah of Yibam, but you don't do it, because the rabbi said don't do it, so we do chalitza. Okay, that's just chalitza lo misyabemes. Achosa she yevimta. So this is you need Rashi to explain the case. We'll see it in the Gemara. Let's say we had three brothers, Reuben and Shimon and Levi. Reuben and Shimon were married to two sisters. Okay. Now we talked about before if Reuben died, and what happens to Shimon in that case? He can't marry his brother's sister because it's his brother's wife because it's his wife's sister, right? Can't marry his brother's wife. That's a chos ishto. So there's no even no chalitza. But let's say Reuben and Shimon both died. They both died. And they left the two wives, Leah and Rachel, two sisters, to Levi. What could Levi do there? So we said before, Atzachos Kukato, right? Each one he can't marry because it's a chos kukato, which is the least drabanan, and you do chalitza over there, right? That's if both sisters. But let's say one of the two sisters was his mother-in-law, was Levi's own mother-in-law, or Levi's daughter, right? Then you do even on the other one. You understand? Two sisters felt him. So normally two sisters fall. We said that's at least a chos kukaso. So it's at least you don't make even over there drabanan, so do chalitza. Remember, always the case. That's the green cloud. We mentioned this before. When you do chalitza and not yibum, there's some reason. The rabbi said either because it's a suffix or it's exer drabanan. Because min Torah should kol she'oli yibum ol chalitza. If there's even as chalitza, if no even there's no chalitza. So in a case where your daughter fell to you yibum, obviously there's no yibum, so there's no chalitza. In a case where it's an Isra mitzvah kedusha, we just say, well, you do say there's a esed chalosa say there. Why don't you? So we say, no, you do chalitza. Why not? We'll see. More. We'll talk about that. Achoser sheyimtim. In this case, Reuben and Shimon are married to two sisters, Leah and Rachel, and they both died. And normally Levi would have to just do chalitza on one of them because each one is a chotz kukaso. If you hold that's machlok, a chotz kukaso. Yeah. But over here, one of either one, either one. Who does he do if they fell? Okay. If they both fall even to him, then he should give chalitza on both. Why? Because they fell from two different houses, Reuben and Shimon. Right? He has to do chalitza on both. That's chos kukaso. Because technically neither was now. If he married one of them, went against the rabbi, it says let's say he married one of them. If it was, he's not Levi's not married to anybody. Reuben and Shimon died married to two sisters, and they both died. So he should marry presumably the one who died first. Let's say they died simultaneously. We had that case yesterday. They died simultaneously. So if he married one of them, then he couldn't. The other one is already automatically forbidden because it's a chos ishto. But what he should do is in that case is give chalitza to both, right? Give chalitza to both of them because it's a chos kukaso. So he gives chalitza to one, gives chalitza to the other one. Let's say though, the case we're talking about here is achosa. It's her sister, but it's also she yivimta. In other words, the sister of this one that you want to marry, the two sisters fell to you from Reuben and Shimon, but one of them is also your mother-in-law or your daughter-in-law or whatever. She's somebody that's forbidden to you, then you could marry the other one, right? Even though they're two sisters. And we said normally if it's two sisters fall to you, yibum, from let's say Reuben and Shimon, each one is a chotz kukaso, so you shouldn't marry either one of them, right? Because it's a chotz kukaso, it's at least rabban. It's not a chotz isha, it's a chotz kukaso. It's the sister of the one who is zakuk to you, so there's a bond there. For the old zika or ain zika, it's a strong bond or a weak bond, but there's a bond that's a chotz kukaso. Fine, it's a machlokas. What do you do there? But let's assume that in that case you shouldn't marry either one, give chalitza to both. But in this case, one of the two sisters was also your mother-in-law, so you can't marry her. So then you could marry the other one. That's the third case in the Mishnah. Could even do yibim because the one who's forbidden to you as an erva is out of the picture. Isser mitzvah. What is it? We said in the Mishnah, Isser mitzvah, Isser kedusha. That's what we're going to talk about mostly today. Those are. We do chalitza, not yibam. What is Isser mitzvah? Shniyos medivrei sofrim. The secondary forbidden relationships, the ones that the Torah didn't specifically forbid. And I give you an example with your grandmother. The Torah doesn't forbid you to marry your grandmother, but the rabbi said you don't. So that's what we're talking about over here. The rabbi said you don't, so you do chalitza. Okay. Isser, right? Because the rabbi said you don't do it. So we have why don't we say, it's not even esed dechalosa say, because there's no losa say over here. It's only in Rabbanan, so the rabbi said do chalitza. Isser kedusha. Isser, what is kedusha? Isser kedusha. It's called an isser of being holy. These are the raisas, right? The Torah says an almana can't marry. Yeah, now that's what we're going to talk about in detail because the almana can't marry a kohen gadol. There's two isurim. There's basula. He's got to marry a virgin. That's a positive mitzvah say. And there's a losa say of almana lo tikach. Okay, so we're going to talk about almana le kohen gadol. So he can't do. He can't do yibam over there. So you do chalitza. Why do you even need chalitza? Ein esedachalosa say the essay. Right? We have a class esedachalosa say. Ein esedachalosa yishbal chorus, but also ein esedachalosa say essay. So the mitzvah of yibam should not override both the assay and the losa say varmana. By a grusha to a kohen, that's a law, right? If it's a grusha b'chalutza l'kohen, again, chalutza is only drabanan, but it's like a grusha. Grusha is the rice, chalutza is drabanan. So in those cases, we say, or mamzeres l'sin Yisrael. Let's say your brother was married to a mamzeres. Shouldn't have, but let's say he was married to her. The kedushin works. and now he dies. Now she falls to Yibam. What do? She's a mamzeres. Well, So, well, you shouldn't do it, right? So what do we say? We say that's called Isser Kedusha. So we say in that case, you give her chalitza. Why do you need chalitza? Because Minat Torah, you need Yibam, right? Because essay do chalosa say. Okay, so we say you do chalitza and said get out of the problem. Mamzer Cecilia Israel or Bas Yisrael and Son Mamzer the reverse. We'll talk about Nisin later on in Yevamos. Mamzer, we know what a mamzer is. It's a bastard, the product of a forbidden union, forbidden under punishment at least of Kores or certainly of Mises Pita Bezin. Nesina were the Gavonim who converted at the time of Yeshua. David HaMelech was gozer that they're like mamzer and they don't mingle with the Jews. Okay, so in those cases we say you do chalitza, not you. So first, let's deal with the nomenclature. What is it called? General principle includes what? We had before machlokas back in Daf Yud. What about an islandess, a woman who can't bear children? She has no female characteristics at all. So she doesn't fit into the pasuk. It says V'haya b'chor asher teilei, right? In the parsha of Yibam, the firstborn, like so to speak, you'll name after the deceased brother. That excludes an islandess. She can't give birth, so she's excluded. So he says, you know what? Klan comes to islandess. She's not really an erva. So he says, she's not really an erva. She's an islandess. She doesn't fit into Yibam. However, so he says, so according to the first opinion, it is included because since the Torah says an islandess is not it's not like your daughter-in-law or your mother-in-law or your sister-in-law. She's just a woman who can't give children, but the Torah considers her like an erva because it's excluded from Asher Teilei. So therefore, like Rashi explained, the first opinion there was Ravasi says over there, islandess is like an erva. So if your wife, remember we talked about there's a 15 case, there's a 16 case like an islandess. Why? Because if your wife is an islandess, so Reuben's wife is an islandess, so her tzara is also patur from Yibam and Chalitza, according to this opinion, because an islandess is like an erva, like she's a forbidden relationship to a Yibam, and therefore she's forbidden like an erva, and also her tzara. That's what the klal. That's the first opinion. Oh wait, let's first finish the Gemara. We'll see. Klal l'suyim my amar from Papa l'suyim tzaras islandess buku Ravasi. Ravasi held that since the Torah says she's like an erva, because the pasuk excluded Asher Tel, she's like a Reuben's wife who had children. So she's your brother-in-law's wife who had children. So here also, since the annals doesn't have Yibam, she's your brother's wife, not brother-in-law's wife, your brother's wife, who's like an erva, and therefore her tzara is also forbidden. That's Ravasi's opinion. We paskined over there otherwise. So the economy, some say kol she'isura isur erva huda asira. So only if it's really an erva, it's a relationship. Your daughter-in-law, your mother-in-law, your sister-in-law, your daughter. Then it's the tzaras aser. Huda isur asa. Halo isuras erva. Over here, it's not really an isur erva. She's just excluded. She doesn't fit into the category of Yibam. She's not really erva, and therefore tzaras lo asira. Lemute might to exclude what Amar Papa. Lemute tzaras islands ulo kravasi. So to say just the opposite. That tzaras islandess does perform Yibam. If your brother Reuben was married to two wives, one was an islandess, one wasn't. It's not like he was married to your daughter and to another wife. In which case, when he dies with no children, you don't perform Yibam Chalitza, not on the daughter, and certainly on the daughter, and even on the tzara. But it's islandess is different. She's not an erva. She's not a forbidden relationship. If you want to marry this woman, a normal person, you can marry this woman. It's not like she's she's not a family relationship over there. She's just excluded from Yibam, and therefore it's not like a Vasi. And that's like what the Gemara Paskin. If you remember back on Daf Yud Beis and Beis, at the very top of the page, it says Hilchasa. Gemara says Saras islandess is Muteras. So if your brother was married to an islandess and he had another wife and he died, you can't perform. There's no Yibam or Chalitza on the islandess. She's forbidden. She's your brother's wife, and without a mitzvah Yibam, you can't marry her. Even if you love her and, not because of children, you just want to marry her, you can't marry her because she's your brother's wife. But her tzara would be mutter. So that's a machlokas whether it's not. So the question is, does klal come to include that it's usher that an islandess is included in like Ravasi, or dafka does come to exclude it? That's the economy says koshi sir erva huda sira. In other words, when it says klalam bivama koshi sir erva, only if it's because of a forbidden family relationship, but not if it's because of some other reason, like over here, that islandess who's forbidden because she can't have children. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes.
Okay. He forgot the question.
Should we say islandess was a coach, but she's not really married?
Okay. Two ways. Two ways.
So she could marry anybody?
Okay, fine. If you say she was a mekach tos, right, then that's the reason why the tzara could be married to her, and it was never married to the brother. He could even marry the islandess right now. Stop. That's if it was a mekach tos because he didn't know she was an annals. Let's say he knew she was an annals, and it's not a mekach tos. He married her anyway. Okay, but either way, she doesn't do even because she's an annals. Okay. So this is a little bit of a complicated case. This is the third case we said where Reuben and Shimon are married to two sisters. They both die, and they fall to Levi. And Levi, in theory, could marry either one of them or do chalitza on both. He's got to do either. He needs yibum on one, either chalitza on both or yibum on one, and then he couldn't perform on the other one. The other one's the chos ishto, so he wouldn't marry her. But in this case, one of the two sisters was also his mother-in-law or his daughter-in-law. So then he could marry the other one. That's what we said. Whose sister is she? Right? The Isser mitzvah. If she's only an Isser of an Isser mitzvah, in other words, she's the sister of somebody who's forbidden to you as a mitzvah, like your grandmother, right? Or keeping the Maraisa Ramile, since Metar Torah, there is a mitzvah even. In other words, the two sisters who fell to you now from Reuben and Shimon, you could marry either one of them. And each one is a chotz kukaso. Why? Because each one is up to you. One is your grandmother, and one is just some other. One is her sister. Your grandmother's sisters. One of them, in theory, you can marry both of them. You can marry either one of them. So each one, therefore, is a chotz kukaso. So how do you say over here that you can marry her? Ela choset iser erva. As I said before, two women fell from Reuben and Shimon to Levi. Reuben and Shimon married to two sisters. And one of the sisters was your mother-in-law, let's say, or your daughter-in-law. Your son had been married to her once. And you can't marry her, so you couldn't marry the sister because she's not the one. The erva is not zakuk to you. Right? She's one of the 15 people who are excluded, so you could marry her sister. Okay, again, they're not sarot. They came from two different brothers, Reuben and Shimon. Isser mitzvah shnias. Now again, what's the Isser mitzvah? Torah, you can marry these people like your grandmother or your great-granddaughter. The Gemara later on will list them, we'll see. Isser mitzvah shnias. Amai kari Isser mitzvah. Why is it called Isser mitzvah? Why is it mitzvah? Amar Rabbi mitzvah lishmo divrei chacham. You're supposed to listen to the rabbis, right? Let's go Isser mitzvah. Just give that name to those people which are secondary arayot that are not really ma'aser min Torah. What is Isser kedusha? Amar l'kohen gadol grusha l'chus l'kohen hediot, as we said, or a mamzer in a single Yisrael. Things that are aser min Torah. But technically, you could make yibum over there. So you could make yibum. Why? Because that's the chalosase. Cohen's not supposed to marry Grusha, right? But his brother married a Grusha. And now his brother died with no children. So the Grusha fell to him to yibum. He doesn't want to be over on the Grusha, right? But on the other hand, he's got a mitzvah. So you say you do chalitza. Okay. Says Gemara, V'amai kar le'isr kedusha. So first, why is that called kedusha? So if it says, Kedoshim Yu Leilo Keim. In other words, when it comes to the Kohanim, all those rules over there in Kedoshim says Kedoshim Yu Leilo Keim. So therefore, the Kohanim are more Kadosh, even though this refers to the Kohanim, right? Amar Kohen Gadol Grusha. My mom's in the sin, it also says Vayamachanecha Kadosh next to moms of the Mefarshim say. So that's also being holy implies that you have to keep these rules. That's why it's called Isra Kedusha. Fine. It's just Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Machlef. He switches them around. He reverses them. He says Isra Mitzvah is the Alman Kohen God and Grusha V'Chotzon Kain Hadyot. Why is it called the Micro Mitzvah? The Sif Eila Mitzvahs. At the end of Vayikra, it says these are the mitzvahs. Talking about Vayikra is barely say, it's also called Torah's Kahanim, right? It's talking has all the rules of Kahanim. It says Eila Mitzvahs. So mitzvahs talking about the rules of Kahanim. Isra Kedusha is Shnias Mitzvah itself. Those are the secondary forbidden relationships that were decreed by the rabbis. That's called Isra Kedusha. Michael, why is it called Kedusha? Because if you fulfill the words of the rabbis, you're called Kadosh. Amalei Rava, what do you mean? It's like, oh, it's optional. If you do that, you're Kadosh. Amalei Rava, it's not Kadosh, but Rasha Nami, just the opposite. If you don't listen to the rabbis, you're a Rasha. It's not like, oh, it's optional. You don't have to listen to the rabbis. That's only for the Orthodox Jews. The other ones don't have to, right? What do you mean? Yeah. If you listen to the rabbis, you're Kadosh. And if you don't, you're just not Kadosh, but you're okay. You're also not a Rasha. You're a Rasha also. The Torah said that you're supposed to make yourself holy even things that are mutter for you. And as we take it a step further, even though your grandmother is technically permitted to you, but we make yourself holy by abstaining even from something which the Torah allows you. Then you're called kadosh. Kadesh, you made yourself more holy. So Rabbi Yehuda simply turns it around. He says it's a mitzvah. The mitzvahs is the mitzvahs referring to Kohanim, and the Yisur Kedusha is to make yourself more holy by taking a step further, by refraining from relationships that are permitted by the Torah, but you're going to take a higher step, listening to the rabbis in this case. That's why it's called Kodesh. But either way, it's just a question of the nomenclature. What do you call Yisur Mitzvah? What do you call Yisur Kedusha? But one refers to the Torah forbidden things that are basically Yisur Lav, right? And the other ones are referring to what the rabbis decree. In both cases, the Mishnah says you do chalitza, you don't do yibum. Now we're going to look at the logic.
That's something else.
That's something else, I think. Why? Why was it Chayim Gershon?
You know,
which Chayim Ben Gershon?
So because
I think that I'm not really sure what the polygamy. I think the polygamy thing was to coincide with the Dina Mechusa, what the Goyim did, so as not to offend or not to be in violation of the domestic regular laws, the common law. I think that was one of the reasons. There's also a reason, to be, you
be holy.
No, and also there might be
wife.
fights in the family, fights among the wives, et cetera. You know what I mean? Maybe he studied Yevamos very well and what of that. But I think it was more to be in common, and that's probably why. I mean, not only because we're in Gershom was the beginning of the Ashkenazim and didn't apply to the. But I think it's the Sephardim because the Sephardim lived in communities where they did have polygamy like they still have today. So I think it was more to come in line with that, but I'm not really sure. Okay. Almana Kohen Gadol. So he said over here, Almana Kohen Gadol, Grusha v'chutza and Kohen. We know a Kohen can't marry Grusha, Kohen Gadol can't marry an Almana. Okay. And the Gemara says, Kapasik Vatani, and you gave it as a general rule, right? A distinct rule you didn't make, it was unqualified. You didn't make any distinction between different kinds of marriages. What do you mean that? No difference if she was an almana from a marriage or almana mena erison. What do you mean by that? If she's an almana from an erison, she was engaged, she was betrothed to a guy, right? And the guy died. She's an almana now, but she's still a virgin. She's still a psula. The Torah forbids a Kohen Gadol to marry an almana, and he must marry a virgin. In this case, the girl could be a virgin, but she's still an almana because her husband died. So let's talk about that. So the Mishnah, the Gemara says, why didn't make any difference between an asuin or mena erison if she's an almana from an asuin or mena erison? So Mishnah mena asuin, if she's an almana there, we can understand why the assay of Yibam does not override the losas of the Kohen Gadol almana. Why? Because there's both a losas of almana lo yikach, and there's a mitzvah say of ki besula me'am of yikach, right? So he'd be over against that. So we understand why he doesn't perform yibam in that case. Why an almana lo Kohen Gadol doesn't perform yibam there, and we say you do chalitza. The question is, why do you even need chalitza in that case? Okay, we'll talk about that, right? Elamina erison. But me'erison lo sasei gredu yava esei b'itchel lo sasei. But if she's only an almana mena erison, that means she's still a psula. So it's an asay of yibam overriding a lo sasei of almana lo yikach. So why don't you say esei decha lo sasei? And it's only right. And this is not a lo sasei sheish bar kares like sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, something of that sort. So why don't we say esei decha lo sasei? That's what the Gemara is going to do. Amar Rav Gidl, Amar Rav. The pasuk says when talking about chalitza. If the guy doesn't want to do yibam, he does chalitza. It says also yivimto ashar, takes her up to the gate, meaning to the court. She'ein tamalom yivimto. Why does it say yivimto again? The pasuk was already talking about yivimto. Rashi says daksiv b'reish l'kra lakachas is yivimto. If he doesn't want to take his sister-in-law as a wife, so what does he do? He takes the yivimto again. Who else is he taking up there? His dog. I mean, he's taking up this lady, right? This sister-in-law. He doesn't want to marry her. So just say, but also it should just say. But also hashara, take her up to the gate, take her up to the court, and then you go through the procedure of the spitting and the removing of the shoe and all that. So why don't you just say, but also hashara? Why does it have to even it wasn't necessary. This is a special case. There's talking about a special case here. There is a Yavama which only does chalitza and not yibum, right? Be'ezuzu, what is that? Chai v'lavin. If there's chai v'lavin, in other words, let's say mamzer to a Yisrael, right? She's a mamzeres and he's a Yisrael, or the other way around. He's a mamzer, she's a Yisraelis, or in the sin of mamzer, or coin to grusha. So you can't marry a grusha, right? Coin can't marry a grusha, and he's got a mitzvah to marry her. His brother was married to a grusha. She had been divorced once before. The coin, his brother married her. Reuben married her, and he died now with no children. She falls even to Shimon. What should Shimon do? So it says, in this case, there's a certain case that he does chalitza dafka, because it says the word yivimto is extra to teach me that even chai v'lavin, what is maybe chai v'kris also. Maybe if your sister-in-law, right, Reuben and Shimon married to two sisters, and Reuben died, what do we say in the first mission in the Masechet? Shimon doesn't have yibam to her, right, nor to the tzara. No, maybe he should do chalitza. When do you do chalitza? If he doesn't want to take her, it's mash, but he could take her. If he doesn't want to take her for a wife, he doesn't want to keep him, then he does yibam. If he wants to miyabam, but right, and so if he can't do yibam on his sister-in-law, he can't do chalitza either. So in this case too, why do you say chayav? Why do you say since he can't do yibam, there's a certain case of a lav, like a mamzer to a Yisraelis, or a kohen to a grusha, or a kohen gadol to an almana who's a psula, right? It's only a lav. So he says, you know what? That's what's like speaking about yivimta. You do chalitza, but why? You just said kol yibim. It says him lo yachvat saish lakasi. He doesn't want to marry or does chalitza. That means he could marry. Either he can marry. It's up to him. You're not defining that there are certain cases which you only have to do chalitza. That's what you're saying. Chai v'lavin, you have to do chalitza from yibum, from the word v'yibimta. You have chai v'lavin nami. So we have two conflicting ideas. On the one hand, the pasuk says, when do you do chalitza? Only if you could do yibum. If you can't do yibum, you don't want to marry her, then you do chalitza. But smash, if you want to, you could. So olo yibum chalitza. And then you have another word that says yibimto. There's certain cases that you do chalitza, l'chatchila, no yibum. This is the case, chai v'lavin, you do chalitza without yibum. And there's a Torah saying you should do that. So we have two conflicting psukim, so that's how we apply them. We say, and kol she'ein olim en chalitza by iser kares. By iser lav, we say no, you do chalitza. How do you know which one? Marisa, how do you know? Mistavra, how do you know which one to say you do chalitza on? Chai v'lav and tafs kedushin. Since chai v'lav and kedushin is chal, as we said, his brother was married to a mamzeres, or his brother was a kohen married to a grusha, or cases like that where it's a lav. Chai v'kris is lo tafs kedushin is not chal, so probably it's probably the case of lav where you're supposed to do chalitza. So at this point in the Gemara, we're saying that the rule of kol ha'ola yibam chalitza does not apply in all cases. Kol sha'ola yibam chalitza, kol she'ein chalitza is only by iser kares, but by iser lav, like a mamzer to a Yisraelis or a kohen to a grusha, then there is a case where you do chalitza and not yibam. The Torah is telling us to do that based on the word yibimto. That's what we're saying at this point. Masav Rava, he's going to ask Kash on this. Iser mitzvah iser kedusha. Right? What's the case? Let's say he had yibum with her. Right? We said before it's either a kohen to a grusha, mamzer Yisrael, or issa drabanan. If he had yibum, or chalatzla, nifter tzarasa. In other words, it's a good yibum. If he did yibum or chalitza, if you say chai v'lavin midaraisa, you can't do yibum. Tells you the pasuk is effectively telling you if you have a chai v'lavin like kohen grusha, do chalitza. If that's what it is. So yibum lo rama, but you can't do yibum because that's what he said. You're just saying that you're not supposed to do yibum. The Torah is telling you lachatchila do chalitza on those cases. If that's the case, so kibala my niftas rasa. If you live with her, if there's no case of yibum, you're not supposed to make yibum. So then the tzara is not petura, right? The tzara is not petura. You have to do yibum on the. You have to do yibum on. And this is not a case where the tzara is pater. Like again, what happened? Ruvain, the brother, a kohen, was married to a grusha, and he had another wife, right? And he had another wife. He dies with no children. Shimon, what is he supposed to do? You're saying at this point, he's supposed to make chalitza on one of the two, or let's say the grusha. He can make a chalitza. He can't marry her. So why do you say over here that if he does yibum, it paters the tzara? He's not supposed to do yibum. If you're not supposed to do yibum, it doesn't pater the tzara. So kibola my niftas rasa. There's no yibum over there. There's no mitzvah of yibum. Effectively, you're saying What? When he
sleeps with it, what is it?
So what? It's forbidden. It's a forbidden relationship. It's like if a man slept with his sister-in-law. What is that? It's forbidden. But it does. He's not married to her. If you're married to a woman and then you marry her sister, what does that mean? No, it doesn't work. It's a forbidden relationship, which your chayiv kar is for, and she is chayiv kar is too. Doesn't work. The mitzvah doesn't work. So how do you say over here it works? If the Torah is telling you that in the case of an Israel law, a coin marrying a grusha, or moms are marrying Israelis, that you're supposed to do chalitza and not supposed to do yibam, so why does the yibam work? That's what it says over here. It says over here, if Isra mitzvah kedusha, ba'aleh, if you slept with her, meaning form yibam or chalitza, and if it's rasa, isat chayiv alav meraisa lechalitza mami bim lamami kibola mam nefes rasa. Who most of law? So he asked this kasha. Rava asked the kasha for who farka. He answered with stadiktan. You're right. The brisa you have to read. There are two separate cases here. Baal is as going on the Isra mitzvah. What's Isra mitzvah? Drabanan. What? No. But the way the Tanakama is, Isra mitzvah is marrying your grandmother. Something that the rabbis forbade. So if the rabbis forbade it, the Torah basically said, yeah, you do make yibam over there, right? You're not supposed to. The rabbi said the rabbis forbade it. So the Mishnah says, do chalitza, get around the problem. You should do chalitza over there, by Isra Drabanan. But so when we say a bala is going on the Isra mitzvah, chalitza is going on the Isra kedusha, on the Isra lav, like a coin marrying a grusha. So he's saying, yeah, you can't do yibam on that. Not saying you do that. So at this point, we're still remaining with this idea that by any chayvi lav, and the Torah says do chalitza. This is an exception to the rule of kol yibam chalitza kosher chalitza. A lav is different. The Torah is telling you do chalitza. That's what we're saying at this point. But now we're going to have a tougher question. Masav Rava. P'tuadaka krushafro. The pasuk says. And pasuk says that you're not a person who is a person who is has crushed testicles or a severed penis is not allowed to marry in the Jewish family. So, or Sodom, he was castrated, or a zakin, an older person. Now here there's no Israel, an older person, but we mean to say that a yibam could apply over here. We'll see. They could do chalitza or make yibam. Okay, what do you mean they will chalitza or yibam? In what case? Two cases. It could work both ways. Was the forbidden person like the Saras or the Ptsuadakar, was he the one who died or was he the one performing yibam? So the Gemara gives both cases. Ketzet, this is the Mishnah says, Ketzet, Mesu, they died, this Saras Adam or Ptsuadak, whatever, he was married to a woman, and the marriage was chal, even though he was supposed to leave the marriage when he had this injury, but he was married to her at the time he died with no children. Mesu v'lahem nashim v'lahem achim. They had wives and brothers. And the brother got up, one of the brothers got up and did mimer on the wife, or nasna get, or he gave a get. Rashi points out over here something we're going to discuss later on. If you don't want to perform yibam, you have to do chalitza, right? That frees her up. Let's say you gave her a get. Well, a get is only in a marriage, not in a yibama, but a get demonstrates that you can't marry her anymore because you've refused. It's a refusal. You still need chalitza, but he can't perform yibam afterwards. Neither him nor his brothers. But we'll see. It's like, yeah, it's the equivalent of that. Well, if you do mimer, you have to do get and chalitza. You need a get and chalitza. You need a get for the mimer and chalitza for the zika. But over here, even if you didn't do anything, they gave her a get instead of doing chalitza, you can't marry her anymore. You still need chalitza. Okay, but that's a side thing. This is over here. If you did mimer or you gave her a get or chaltza, you give chalitza. Masha asu. In other words, if this person, the Ptsua Dakar was married and died with no children, and his brothers did get or chalitza or whatever they masha asu, and if they married her, they were kona. Mesu achim. Now the other way around. Let's say the Ptsua Dakar's brother died. Ptsua Dakar or the Koroshafa or the Soros, somebody who's not supposed to be married to a Jewish woman. His brothers died. Now he's not supposed to perform yibam, right? Because he's not supposed to marry her, but on the other hand, he's got a mitzvah. What is this? It's Isra Lav, right? Same thing. He has a mitzvah of yibam, and there's a losa say not to marry this, not for this guy not to marry any Jewish woman. So Mesu Achim, the brother died. Reuben, his regular brother, died. Ba'am Duhaim, and this Shimon is now a Krushafcha or a Psuadaka or a Sarasadim. Ba'am Duhaim, Ba'asu Maimer, they did Maimer, or B'nasu Get, or Shachalzu, Masha also Asu Vim Balu Kadam. If he may be, he was toner. So what does that mean? Yibam works. What did we just say? We said before that Yevimta tells me that in certain cases where it's an Isra Lav, where you're over on a Losa, say, not a Losa Shifakar, it's just a regular Isra Lav, that what you're supposed to do, the Torah says you're supposed to do Chalitza. No Yibam. So why does Yibam work over here? It says we're in Balu Kanu, even though that's an Isra Lav. He goes, also now it says in Balukanu, he performed Yibam, also Lakayim, but he can't stay married to her. Mishim Shnemeli of Tzudaka, Kushav Kalashem. Isak, the Daita Chavilav Midaraisa Lachalitza Rami. If you tell me Chavilav, you're supposed to get Chalitza, Yibam Lo Rami, not supposed to do Yibam. There's no mitzvah Yibam over there. Simbalu my Kana. Why is it Kona? It doesn't work. In other words, if the Torah doesn't sanction the Yibam, it doesn't work. If a man dies with children, Reuben died having children. So what's the halacha? She's usher. Let's say he marries her anyway, like Mo's father did, right? Right? So if the marriage doesn't work, the Yibam doesn't work. It's this Rakaris. It doesn't work. So why over here does it work? Elam Rav, so forget that whole thing. So this knocks off the idea that there is an exception to the rule of you have to take that. What do you do with Yibimta or whatever? We'll figure that out later on. But this takes away that idea. Why? Because it doesn't work because as we've just proved that even by Chayv Elavin, Yibam does work. You can't say there's no mitzvah of Yibam. There's only mitzvah of Chalitza and Chayv Elavin. You see over here, Yibam does work. Elo Marava Almana Lekoin Gadol Mina Eris Nami Esabelos. So first he says, you know what? So the question over here was, well, why don't you say Esabelos? So I'll tell you why. Because Almana Mina Eris is also Esa and Lo Sasei. She's still a psula, so what are you over on? They're supposed to be kadosh. So it's supposed to be kadosh. So there's another asay. Besides the los asay of Almana Lo Sikach, there's a mitzvah asay of kadoshim you. Mamzeres and sees the Michael. What about over there? It says viskadashtem. You're supposed to be holy. Whenever there's a los asay, and you could say there's not a simple los asay. There's always an asay with it. Make yourself holy. You're supposed to be holy. Says, I'll tell you what. You know why you can't make Yibam and Almanam and Erison? It's not because there's no mitzvah, right? It's not because there's no mitzvah, because we've just proved wherever there's a mitzvah of Chalitza, there's a mitzvah of Yibam, there's a mitzvah of Chalitza. So what's the reason why Almanam and Erison? Why don't you perform Yibam? Because Almanam Masuin, you don't do because it's essay, Dochalos essay. And it's an assay going against an assay and a los assay. So by Erison also make Xera Atu because of that. You don't either one. And therefore you do Chalitza. Because it's Xera, you do Chalitza, right? Because it's Xera, you do Chalitza. Where do we do Chalitza when you don't do Yibam? As we said, when there's Yibam, there's Chalitza. There's not even Chalitza. But in any case, the Gemara says you do Chalitza when it's a suffix or it's a drabban. And the rabbi said don't do it. So here it's Xera, you don't marry a Muslim. Mamzer Sina, what do you about Mamzer Sina? Xera Makam Mitzvah, Shalom Makam Mitzvah. Even Makam Mitzvah, you don't perform it, even though it's Esed Dochalos. Say, so the Yibam should override the Isser of Mamzer, but because we don't want you to do it in the case where there's no mitzvah, like Stam Mamzer. So it's Xera because of that. The Gemara will slug this up soon. You should never marry Yibam, your brother's wife. You shouldn't marry your brother's wife from Yibam, because if that's the case, you might marry your brother's wife, your brother from your mother's side, where there's no Yibam there. Why don't you say that? That's no, you wouldn't have such a Yibam, but Nachla Tala Rahman. It depends on Nachla, right? As we say, because he's Nochel, his brother's Chelik, and they share for the same father together. Maybe that people know that it depends on Nachla, and you don't inherit together with your brother. It doesn't go by the mother. Isha she'ein labanim. In other words, because the mother really, kids could get a rush if there's no husband, but basically the bal's yoresh sishto. Isha she'ein labanim lotus yabim. What about a woman? Okay, we're a regular case of yibim that there's no children. She's also not like yibim zeir mishemesh she'esh labanim. Zeir because if the brother had children, so also make zeir there too. Says no. This babanim talk, everybody knows it depends on children. If there's no children, you make yibim. If there's children, you don't make yibim. So maybe people know. What about Shahayabalam? In other words, a regular case of Yibim, where you Shimon shared a life with Reuven. Shouldn't make Yibim Zayr. In other words, all these cases if you're making Zayrs, why don't you make these Zayrs too? Don't make Yabim in any case, because maybe it's here Shalom. The answer is that's the Yeshiva Tali Rachma. Everybody knows that it depends on living together in the same world. Maybe other people know. So Kol Nashim Lotus Yabevna. Nobody should perform Yibim Zayr Mishim Islanders. Maybe the wife will be an islandess, right? You should, just like you shouldn't marry an islandess. So Xera, you might come to marry an islandess, so don't make it even at all. So that's lo shchich. It's not all. It doesn't happen very often. That it's very rare that somebody's an islandess. I don't even know if they have cases today. So Gemara Mamzer what?
Nowadays there are people that don't want to have children.
Right.
So what happens in that case? You have two brothers.
Right.
One has children. The other one
Right. The mitzvah.
want to have
Right.
children.
Right. But the yibum doesn't depend on having the children. It's a mitzvah to have the children. But if he doesn't,
You don't want to have children.
okay. So what? It doesn't make any difference. That's the mitzvah in the Torah. The mitzvah in the Torah is to have children. You're saying if the person doesn't,
You can't force it.
you can't force anybody to do anything. You can't force people to put on tefillin. You can't force people to keep Shabbos. I mean, but this is the Torah. The Torah. Torah says me, but you do it or you don't do it. What? Well, you can't force them to do chalitza either. That's, the cases today when we only do chalitza, I told you before, that happens very often. You need chalitza today, and the brother doesn't want to do it because he's not religious. He wants to.
That's not Moshe's case.
Yeah.
Case
Yeah.
the woman doesn't want to have children.
Okay, but that's not the issue. The issue is supposed to make yibum, even if there's no children, even if not going to have children, it's still a mitzvah to do yibum. So Neges Mishmas says lo shchicha. So Mamzer Sosin is also lo shchicha. It's not. It doesn't happen very often. And you said the reason why don't we say that Mamzer Sosin? So what's the reason why Mamzer Sosin that you don't make yibum? Because you might come to do it and marry on a regular case where it's not a case of yibum. But that's not shchiach. Elam Rava, we come back to the final answer. Elam Rava, why don't we perform yibum in the case of Kohen Gadol marrying an almana erusin, where it's only esed chalosa say gzeir be rishon to be a shniya. Same thing with the mamzer. The truth is esed chalosa say, and technically, your sister-in-law that fell to you yibum is a mamzeres. You should perform yibum and then divorce her with no children, unless you have a child from the first bia. But that's what you have to do. Technically, you're good. Why don't you? Why do we say do chalitza? The rabbis do chalitza because the first bia is permitted. As the chaloseh, but once you perform yibum, once you perform the bia and perform the yibum, you fulfill the mitzvah. Now that's the mitzvah. There's no mitzvah that nobody says if you didn't have children for whatever reason, she didn't want children, he didn't want children, they couldn't have children, whatever it was, that you didn't perform the mitzvah of yibum. The yibum is marrying her. You married her, you consummated the marriage, you crime the mitzvah. Now you're going to keep her as a wife. Now you can't because you're a Kohen, she's an almana. You're a Kohen, she's a grusha. You're a mamzer, she's not, or vice versa. So we made it say you shouldn't marry the first. You shouldn't have the first. Ought to be a shniya. That's why the rabbi said you make a chalitza. So technically, essay is do chalosa. And technically, in a Torah, if a mamzeres fell to you, you should perform yibum, but then you should walk away. Then give her a get. That's the point. Let's just finish more. In balu kanu. If you may be your Kohen, we said before, that's would be Rishona in Balu Kono, right? In those cases where you didn't Balu, if you married her, Kohen. But also a Kaima, but you shouldn't keep her as wife, be a Shnira. Then Rabba said, Bitem Ravashi, Lab Milson, forget about what I just said. Forget about this Xera. I'll tell you a different reason. Say, when you have an essay contradicting a if you could do both of them, you have an essay going against a loss say. The best option is to keep both of them, to try to do it if they're not simultaneous, right? That's only if it's simultaneous. Try to do it at different times. Try to fulfill both of them. Mutta. Im lava, if you have no choice, if you can perform both, if there's a chance to do both, to fulfill both, not to be over the loss say, and still to kind of essay, so do it. So Hachanami Efshe b'chalitza. Here you can do chalitza. You have an option. Do chalitza. Go on to Esed, let's say the Makayim essay, Velosay Makayim essay. So you don't have to come on to the Gzeir B'Rishat of Bishnia. They say, what do you mean in Balukanu? It says if they're in Balukanu. So if you're saying that there's no mitzvah there's no mitzvah to do the assay yibum and being over the loss say because you have an option of chalitza, that means that there's no mitzvah of yibum because you have an option of chalitza. So how do you say in Balukanu? Balukana means even though there's a lav over here, your kona, it works. What do you mean? There's no mitzvah. Esadoch said there's a mitzvah to do it over here. But if you have an option not to be over, if if I can perform the mitzvah of tzitzis without being over on tchelas, let's say, so I should do it that way. What we do today, right? We do it that way. Don't be over about. But over here you have an option. What do you mean? If that was an option, why is it balukana? There's no yibum over here. It's takakasha on this answer, and we come up with the first answer. The first answer is why can't a Kohen marry an almana min a erison, or why can't a Kohen, a regular Kohen, a Kohen gadol can marry an almana, or a Kohen marry a grusha? Technically, he could perform yibum, but the problem is that he'd have to divorce her. So the rabbi said, "Gzeira be rishon to bish." It's only because of gzeira. And Rashi says this is also a kasha on Rish Lakish himself. Why? Because why would Rish Lakish say over here, this is not a case where you could do both, but we'll see in a minute why this is not a shlug up on Rish Lakish. Rashi says this is also a shlug up on Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says if you could do both of them, nine, but it says in Balu Kano. We'll see Itmar Bias, this just finishes the Gemara. Itmar Bias Kohen Gadol be'almana. If a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, That doesn't part to the tzara. Meaning that it's not a yibum. It's not a yibum. If she was an almana who had been married, why? If the Kohen Gadol marries an almana who's an almana min anasuin, that means she's not a psula. So she's over on what? On a lo saseh of almana lo tikach and on psula tikach. So es is not docha lo saseh. So there's no mitzvah of yibum over there. So everybody agrees over there. And therefore, if she had a co-wife, there's no mitzvah to do it on her, do it on the co-wife. You have to even do it on the co-wife. Marrying her is forbidden. It's like I said, it's marrying your sister-in-law, marrying your daughter. It's not a marriage, it's not a yibum. Where all you're over is on a lav of amar lo tikach, right? Why? So it patters at your yibum it is, right? Yibum it is. If you marry if a Kohen Gadol marries an almana min ha'erusin, he performed yibum. As the say, umandam einu poteres. The one says lo asiyase v'dochalo say. He doesn't. Why? Kivim de'efshar b'chalitza, because you could do chalitza meisvei in bolukona. Well, here the Mishnah said before he is kona. If you're saying that essay is not dochalo because there's no essay over here because you could do chalitza, so why do you say in bolukona? It's a forbidden relationship. It's takakasha. It's takakasha on him because it's a bolukon. It does work. Is it also kasha mishlakish? Because Rav said wherever you can perform, if you can perform the essay without being over on the los essay, you should do that. You should do that, right? So it's a kasha mishlakish also because mishlakish seems to say you should do chalitza. No, I'm not talking about the case of chalitza. Yibam and chalitza are two different mitzvahs. You're supposed to do yibam if that's the best option if you can. Today we don't do yibam because we're afraid of carnal intentions, right? And there are many other cases where you could do like the rabbi said, do chalitza to avoid the problems of an israbanan or gzeira, right? Aval chalitza makami is not a mitzvah. In other words, Rish Lakish didn't say his point over here. Rish Lakish could say, I'm talking about when you do a mitzvah, right? When you do a mitzvah, if you could perform the mitzvah without being over on the losase, that's what I say. Meaning, if the option is only esedochalose, there's no option. There's no way to do the essay without being over losase, esedochalose. But if there's an option to perform the essay and to perform the losase and to fulfill losase, you should do that. But over here, chalitza is not the same mitzvah as yibum. Over here, it's not the same mitzvah, right? He's not saying. Rish Lakish didn't say. Rava wanted to apply his reasoning and say, oh, you know what? You don't have to come with the Gzeir Bi Rishon to be a Shnia, because you have Rish Lakish's idea of what? That if you can avoid the Lo Sasai by performing an Asay in a different way, do that. But over here, the mitzvah of Chalitza is not the same as Yibum. It's an option, but it's not the same as Yibum. So it's not, if you did Chalitza, it's not like you performed the same mitzvah and also we're not over on the Lo Sasai. It's not the same thing. Therefore, it's not a Kasha Rish Lakish, but it's a kasha on the one who says that what what do you mean? You see over here that yibum does work. So at the end of the day, what do we come out with a lav? That there's eses dochalosase, and technically you perform the yibum Yisrael and a mamzeres, a coin on a grusha. Here's your classic case today. A lady's a grusha, married to the Kohen's brother, and he dies with no children. Falls yibum. What do you do? So of course the Mishnah says you do chalitza. Why? Why do you do chalitza? Because minat Torah you can perform yibum. Because esadochalosah say. But there goes a bia rishona ought to be a shniya. The mitzvah is only the first time when you consummate the marriage. But then the rest of their lives he's not supposed to stay with her. Just like if a kohen marries a grusha today. Kedushin works. Kedushin works. He's not supposed to. The rabban won't sanction it. But it's if you have two Adam and it's a proper marriage, it's a proper marriage. However, he's living in sin, because he's not supposed to stay married to her. Same thing over here. That's what we mean over here. We'll pick up here tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.
Why is it also the sheni when the mitzvah of Yibum is to have children?
Right.
In
Okay.
the name of the brother.
Correct.
So until you have children,
right. So right. So the pasuk says that's the option. That's the optimal thing. The optimal thing is your idea is supposed to marry and have children. But in this case, you can't, because the mitzvah itself is not performed by a long-term thing. The mitzvah is to get married. There's also in general, there's a mitzvah, the mitzvah of there's different mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of pruvu, to have children, right? That's a mitzvah that everybody has. The mitzvah is not to get married per se. The mitzvah is how do you fulfill the mitzvah of having children? By getting married in the right way, right? But the mitzvah is to have children. The mitzvah is not to get married per se. Here, the mitzvah is to get married. The yibum is performed by getting married to her. Now, yes, the long-term thing is to have children, but then that's
the mitzvah of yibum is to carry on the process.
But the mitzvah not true. No, not so. The mitzvah's yibum is performed as soon as he consummates marriage. That's the yibum. That's the optimal thing is he's supposed to be married to her, and eventually she should have children. If they die with no children, he didn't perform the mitzvah. The mitzvah performs right away. It's not the same as pruah, where the mitzvah is only when there are children there that he fulfills the mitzvah. The mitzvah here is performed as he consummates the marriage. The idea is yes, supposed to have children and et cetera, and that's the optimal way, and hopefully that'll work out. But that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to consummate the marriage.